Journalist Yulia Latynina analyzed the presence of Putin's doubles on the examples of his visits to the occupied territories of Ukraine, as well as during the appearances of the dictator in public. In her publication in Novaya Gazeta Europe, Latynina emphasizes the difference between real Putin and copies. The dictator who keeps a decent distance even from his closest associates and is terrified of any contact during the so-called visits to the occupied territories suddenly completely changes.
This Putin personally drives along the Crimean Bridge, however the back of his head is mostly filmed on this trip. Visits Mariupol at night driving a car where he turns on the turn signals and stops at the traffic lights, and even visits frontline territories by helicopter. Yulia Latynina, journalist from the blog and the publication Novaya Gazeta Europe.
The fact that it was doubles who came to the south and east of Ukraine is also convinced by the head of the main intelligence directorate of the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine, Kyrylo Budanov. In his opinion, some inconsistencies are clearly visible.
There are generally little gaps because each of his trips there is a certain protocol that they never violate. He must be accompanied by a plane from the presidential group. This time they forgot it.
The German publication Bild studied Putin's doubles. According to journalists, during his many visits over the past 6 months, the double was given out by a dropping upper lip and cheap shoes. On March 19th, during Putin's trip to Russian-occupied Mariupol, analysts noted a receding chin and an old-fashioned hairstyle with strands of hair at the back of his head. According to the gait and gestures, it is almost impossible to distinguish twins. Experts are sure they can be trained, but the oracles are unique.
They are authentic like fingerprints. To date, I see 3 doubles and 1 in the bunker. But at the same time, I am not sure that the bunker one is original. Who really took power from Boris Yeltsin?
According to Bild, there are at least 2 types of fake Putins. One of them is allowed to speak and the other is obliged to remain silent.
There is another regularity. This is how the Putin representative, who behaves like Putin, is perceived by the leaders of other states. For me, Alexander Lukashenko is a special example, and the presidents and prime minister of the CIS countries. They allow themselves to behave with a double in a completely different way. For example, Lukashenko allows himself to sneer and joke. The prime minister of Kyrgyzstan generally allows himself to be late.
The exact number of Putin's doppelgangers is currently unknown. Experts call fakes authorities a red herring. After all dictators were afraid of an assassination attempt. For example, it is known that Joseph Stalin, Fidel Castro and Saddam Hussein had copies. Participation in the debates at the first meeting of the UN Security Council chaired by Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov. Ministers of 4 countries took part: Ghana, Gabon, Cuba and the United Arab Emirates. The rest of the delegations of the countries participating in the Security Council, and there are 15 of them, were represented either by permanent representatives or their deputies. So these countries expressed their attitude towards the Russian Federation in the language of diplomacy.
By organizing this debate, Russia is trying to portray itself as a defender of the UN Charter and multilateralism. Nothing can be further from the truth. It's cynical. We all know that while Russia is destroying, we are building. While they violate, we protect. The UN Charter, the UN General Assembly, the ICJ, the ICC, everywhere you look, Russia is in contempt.
At the debate in the UN Security Council, which is designed to prevent and extinguish military conflicts, the US permanent representative reminded Lavrov that Russia uses people as pawns in its political game and called on the Kremlin to release prisoners in Russia. US citizens Wall Street Journal reporter Evan Gershkovich and former Marine Paul Whelan, the US citizen, was detained 4 years ago on false charges of espionage.
Russia has violated universal human rights and fundamental freedoms both outside and inside its own borders. It has violated international law. That includes the wrongful detention of American citizens. Paul Whelan, Trevor Reed, Brittany Griner, and now Evan Gershkovich. Trevor and Brittany are now thankfully home, safe and sound.
UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres also criticized Russia's actions.
Tensions between major powers are at an historic high. So are the risks of conflict through misadventure or miscalculation. Russia's invasion of Ukraine, in violation of the United Nations Charter and international law, is causing massive suffering and devastation to the country and its people.
The permanent representative of China also spoke sharply towards Russia. He stated that it is unacceptable for any country to distort the meaning of international law, formalize its will and the so-called international order, and unreasonably violate the legitimate rights of other countries.
If a major state arbitrarily turns important treaties and agreements relating to international peace and security into dead letters, then not only will international law be undermined, but there will be no world peace at all. In this regard, the country concerned should seriously consider its actions.
Lavrov himself, as chairman of the meeting of the UN Security Council, was forced to listen to all these statements. Previously, he just left the room. In response, he read the already traditional Russian thesis that the UN is in a deep crisis, and the United States and Western countries are to blame for this. In addition, they allegedly refuse diplomacy and demand a showdown on the battlefield. To this, 27 EU ambassadors to the UN demanded from the Russian Federation a complete and unconditional withdrawal of troops from the territory of Ukraine.
Upholding the rules-based order, a term Russia deliberately misinterprets, means respecting international law and the UN Charter, and ensuring that these rules applies to everyone, so that might does not make right.
But the main idea in the face of Lavrov is to demonstrate his influence on the world stage, including in the UN. International isolation due to full-scale invasion of Ukraine forced Russia to take a closer look at Africa. In the countries of the global south, Russia is trying to find support and at the same time spread their influence over them. That is why on April 1st, when Russia began to chair the UN, President of Ukraine Volodymyr Zelensky announced the need to reform the UN, so that a terrorist state and any other state that wants to be a terrorist cannot destroy the world.
The consideration of the case of Mariupol collaborator Mikita Averkin is coming to an end in the courtroom of the Zhovtnevy court. After the beginning of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, the former social activist voluntarily went over to the side of the Russian occupiers, and he began work in the social sphere of the so-called local administration of the occupied Mariupol.
According to the fact that he is the boss, he performs organizational and administrative functions and directly influences the formation of the worldview of the youth of the city of Mariupol, conducts the so-called education of the youth of the city of Mariupol. This person directly influences the youth of Mariupol and forms public opinion among young people.
Averkin's case is considered by the court in Dnipro in absentia. Suspected of collaborationism in temporarily occupied Mariupol, his side in court is represented by a state lawyer via video. For half a year, that is how long the consideration of the case lasted, the court examined all the evidence and already made a decision.
Averkin Mikita was found guilty of committing a criminal offense under Part 5 of Article 111 of the Criminal Code of Ukraine and sentenced to 10 years in prison with confiscation of all his property in favor of the state.
In the Zhovtnevy court of Dnipro, such a decision was made against a collaborator for the first time. If Averkin does not appeal against it within the allotted time, after the occupation of Mariupol, Ukrainian law enforcement officers can immediately detain him.
If law enforcement agencies find this person, this sentence should be immediately executed. That is, there will be no pre-trial investigation or judicial investigation.
After the sentencing of Averkin, another high-profile case began to be considered in this court, on charges of treason against a Mariupol ophthalmologist. According to the Office of the Prosecutor General of Ukraine, in March 2022, during the occupation of Mariupol, the Russian military seized the buildings of the Regional Intensive Care Hospital. At that time, at least 7 Ukrainian servicemen were there.
As soon as our district was occupied by invaders, ophthalmologist Valentina Chekhova immediately appeared at work. Before that, she was absent. In 2 days, she collected all the information about the soldiers of the armed forces of Ukraine who were in the hospital. We tried in every possible way to save them, change clothes, burn documents, eliminate any signs of attitude to military service, and this creature just took and handed them over. What happened to them is unknown. Denis Kozlov, Mariupol intern doctor, in an interview with Facts publication.
After the stories of doctors who managed to leave the occupied Mariupol, collaborator Chekhova was declared suspect.
During the medical round, acting deliberately and for the benefit of the occupying armed forces of the Russian Federation, she voluntarily and knowingly handed over to them information about the stay of at least 7 seriously wounded and sick servicemen of the armed forces of Ukraine, thereby assisting in carrying out subversive activities against Ukraine. From a message on the website of the Prosecutor General's Office of Ukraine.
For high treason in wartime conditions, Ukrainian legislation provides for the maximum punishment, life imprisonment.